Okay, so this evening's talk is titled The Atrocity Tour, the cinematic mythology of Manson, Jonestown, Waco, and Heaven's Gate. And what we're talking about this evening, oh wait a minute, let's go back a bit. What we're talking about this evening is what happens when cults get spoken about in discourse, that invariably certain events in the history of cults come up and they have an inescapable gravity. They are a thing that just poisons the discourse about the idea of the cult. Before the Second World War, you had the idea of kooks and cults and people in strange religious groups, and that was just a thing, really. That was just how it went. And then around the 1960s, stuff happened, and since then, since the end of the 20th century, whenever a cult is mentioned, somebody invariably brings up certain groups, certain stories, certain things we are afraid of. Now, I talked some weeks ago about brainwashing and how that happens, and about the entire industry of atrocity stories, about groups like the Moonies, about the recent case with Keith Ranier's Nexium group, which is sort of partly a cult and partly a sort of multi-level marketing pyramid scheme, partly a sort of sex slave scam. All of these things at once. But the cults, there are certain events where terrible things happen surrounding cults, and these have infected our pop culture. So I'm going to talk a bit about movies that are affected by these stories, movies that are inspired by these stories and which draw from them to tell stories because they are part of our 20th and 21st century social mythology. Now, before I start, I'm obviously, the title says Manson, Jonestown, Waco, and Heaven's Gate, and I am assuming you know who these people were, that you know what happened here in this case. But I want to talk about a fifth one first as well. So just for a moment, I want to mention Shoko Asahara. Now, Shoko Asahara was the leader of a group called Aumshkirio, which is basically a group that was a Buddhist doomsday cult in Japan, basically. And you probably know that in 1995, Aum Shinrikyo even orchestrated an attack on the Tokyo subway. They opened canisters of sarin gas, and they killed 13 people. The leader, Shoko Asahara, was arrested fairly quickly and put on trial, and he was sentenced to death because in Japan they have the death penalty. And he was executed in 2018 after obviously the inevitable, years and years of appeals and attempts at reform and all those things. But eventually he and 6 other senior members of Aum Shinrikyo were hung. Now, this is significant because this has affected pop culture in Japan to a significant deal. Japanese pop culture is affected by this in such a sense that there have been several movies about the Aum Shinrikyo subway attack. But this is the point where I confess that I haven't been able to source a copy of any of them, and I definitely haven't been able to find one in English. So while and I mean this is both my fault, but it's also a fault of our wider culture that we're not particularly interested in stuff like this. So there, for instance, is a movie about a woman who was a member of the Aum Shinrikyo and has to deal with her guilt of these things. Now, that's just to say, this is the one big cult atrocity story that I'm going to have to just sort of mention, say that there are movies, but I can't really tackle it in any great detail. Now, let's talk about the ones that I can attack in detail, and we're going to go through them one by one, okay? And the most obvious one, the one that has the largest effect on our pop culture, I think, is to do with the cult led by Charles Manson in the late 60s, the Manson family. Now, in 1969, a group of followers of Charles Manson, inspired by him because of his teaching about a coming race war, which he called Helter Skelter. He named it after the Beatles song because he literally didn't know that Helter Skelter was like a sort of circular slide thing that you have in a fairground, because that's sort of a British reference. He called it Helter Skelter, and he wanted to start a race war by murdering people and making it look like black people did it. And the idea was that the black people might rise up and become free, and then Manson and his family would lead them as white saviors. And there are obviously so many ways, and Manson was basically a swivel-eyed nutcase, right? He was a very, very disturbed man. Well, all right, disturbed, but I mean, again, we talk about mental illness, we talk about all these other things. Well, how mental ill was he, or was he simply just sort of like a swivel-eyed, bigoted nutcase? We don't know. But anyway, 1969, he orchestrated 2 nights of killings in Beverly Hills in Hollywood, and 6 people lost their lives, or 5 or 6 people lost their lives. In Abigail Folger, Wojciech Fryczkowski, Stephen Parent, Jay Seprik, the actor Sharon Tate, who was the wife of the film director Roman Polanski, pictured, and also her unborn child, who was very near to term, who had already been named Paul, and who is listed customarily among the victims. Manson and several of his followers were arrested and imprisoned for this. And the only film I'm going to look at which actually dramatizes one of these cult atrocities, because there are several movies that dramatize what Manson did. Like, most recently, you've got Quentin Tarantino's wish fulfillment fantasy, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which in the end actually changes the ending of the Manson killings. But the most recent, one of the most significant ones recently was Mary Harron's movie, Charlie Says. Now, Mary Harron is probably best known for directing the movie of American Psycho. Charlie Says stars Hannah Murray, who plays Leslie Van Houten, and it's shown from her viewpoint. It's actually a dramatization of a book by a prison counselor called Carleen Faith, who spent several years working alongside Leslie Van Houten in prison. Leslie Van Houten, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and some others were sent to prison because even though not all of them actually did anything on the nights of the murders, some of them were present, all of them were present, Leslie Van Houten never actually killed anyone, never actually hurt anyone. She was involved, she was implicated, but Manson insisted that his followers all be tried together for murder, and they did so. perfectly. And the film Charlie Says, which stars Matt Smith as Charles Manson in a supporting role, because it's actually really about Hannah Murray's character, Leslie Van Houten, is about the way in which Leslie, who fell into Charles Manson's orbit, the way in which she's sort of lonely, and she's lonely, she's shy, she's socially awkward, and she gets drawn into this Manson family. She gets renamed by him. He calls her Lulu, and she gets reinvented as a sort of radical fomenter of rebellion. Manson tries to get himself a record career, and this is sort of, it's altered slightly from the historical record, but essentially he makes a record, no one buys it, mainly because it's crap. Okay, I don't know if you actually heard Charles Manson's records, they're not great. And he decides that the victims of his first attempt at starting a race war are going to be essentially the people who he thinks let him down in the record industry. Only it turns out that it's actually Sharon Tate and her friends were house sitting, and the guy with the record company wasn't there. So it's all doubly tragic and fortuitous. Manson is magnetic. It's kind of weird. One of the things that it really gets across is that Manson's charisma was not foolproof. It didn't work on everyone. And this is vitally important to remember when you get to any cult leader. You know, cult leaders of any kind are incredibly charismatic, except when they're not. Their followers are utterly devoted, except when they're not. Manson changes the names of the people who follow him. He builds up and knocks down and essentially makes them dependent upon him. But it doesn't work for everybody. Some people came and went. And the film Charlie Says sort of represents how people came and went, and they didn't sort of uniformly just fall to his amazing charismatic powers, because actually he wasn't that charismatic. It's just he had certain techniques which worked on some people, and Leslie Van Houten was one of them. In the end, she's present at the murder. There's this very kind of visceral scene where she's spattered with the blood of Sharon Tate's corpse. No, not Sharon Tate's corpse, the other lady at the La Bianca house the following night. But fundamentally, she's made to be part of this cult. She falls prey to it. And even after he was in prison, you had his followers, and they're all there after he's in prison, and they carve X's into their foreheads and shaved their heads and did vigils outside the prisons while the trials were going on. And in the film, they actually have the women in prison, Susan, Patricia, and Leslie, doing that in the prison, shaving their heads in the prison, because it's not strictly accurate, but it's a more powerful image for the course of the film. So I understand why Mary Harron made that happen. And Guinevere Turner, who was a scriptwriter, who has collaborated with Mary Harron on pretty much everything she's done. That willingness to mutilate yourself in a certain way is part of that thing. They're doing it for the sake of Charles Manson. The film shows the prison journey of Leslie Van Houten, of Patricia Krenwinkel and of Susan Atkins. Susan Atkins is still in prison, as is Leslie Van Houten. Susan Atkins is now an evangelical Christian. She found Jesus quite late on, and this, you know, you can make of that what you will, but the point, the general point is that the film sort of shows how you awaken from this. It shows the remorse felt once they realized that Helter Skelter wasn't going to happen, once they realized that it was a kind of a racist myth, once they realized that Manson was basically just talking rubbish. It's really useful to get this across, and there are very few films that show this in a really proper way. Now, another film that draws upon the Manson mythology is Panos Cosmatos's weird, very heavy metal fantasy Mandy, which came out in 2018. Mandy, as you may know, stars Nicolas Cage, who lives in he's a lumberjack, and he lives in a kind of forest idyll with his fantasy art making, fantasy book reading girlfriend Mandy, who's played by Andrea Riseborough, and they're fairly ordinary people, and they're happy and they're in love until a cult comes along, and the cult leader, it's called Jeremiah, wants to recruit Mandy into his cult, and she laughs in his face, and he essentially murders her, and then Nicolas Cage goes on a rampage, a bloody rampage. And again, what Mandy does is it sort of suggests what might have happened if Charles Manson had sort of stuck around, if he hadn't been caught. The idea, you have this cult and they're living in Winnebago, and they're sort of driving around, and they're kind of rubbish, and they're sort of making deals with mad drug crazed bikers, and this sort of, you know, and he forces Mandy to listen to a record he made from a band he was in, and you know, she's like, this is crap. And it sort of extrapolates, and again you have this sort of cult leader who builds people down, he builds people up, he knocks people down, he pits them against each other, he plays favorites just like Manson did. And so you see this sort of development. It's like the cult leader in Mandy isn't directly based on Charles Manson, but you can't fail to see the influence there of Manson's reach over pop culture has come to such an extent that he's basically become the sort of go-to for the fictional small-time cult leader, even though actually the way that cults work, Manson's own cult in real terms is actually kind of an outlier, but in fiction it's all over the place. And partly I think that's because it's a Hollywood cult. I think that Hollywood took the Manson family cult as its own because it was a Hollywood tragedy, it was a Hollywood murder. Hollywood people were affected, and so people made films and wrote books about the things that they knew. You know, when it's, you know, the most famous people in the English-speaking world, in the most famous place in the English-speaking world, you're inevitably going to have a bit of gravity simply by the fact of where it is. Another film that draws very strongly upon the Manson mythology is Sean Durkin's wonderful 2011 film Martha, Marcy, May, Marlene. And Elizabeth Olsen comes right out from under the shadow of her older sisters, Mary Kate and Ashley, and essentially becomes the, you know, the start. She plays a young woman who's kind of lost, kind of wandering, and meets a bunch of lovely people in the commune, and gradually gets drawn into their world, and to such an extent that she once again is made dependent upon she escapes, and she goes to stay with her sister, who's played by the wonderful Sarah Paulson, and can't really get past her experiences as a member of the cult. The cult was led by a man called Patrick in the film, who's played by the wonderfully sinister John Hawkes, who you know from things like Deadwood and Winter's Bone. John Hawkes plays Patrick as the sort of man who builds up, he knocks down, he plays the guitar again, and he renames all the women. So Martha is renamed Marcy May by him, and he sings a song which basically, you know, he sings the lyrics, she's just a picture on my wall, and essentially she's a collection, she's one of his gallery, and of course invariably winds up one of his harem as well as the women, as Charles Manson's women were. Manson's talk about free love largely was a way for him to get laid a lot. And such is the case with Patrick too. And the other thing with Patrick is, of course, that he's murderous. He's got murderous plans, and these aren't explicitly laid out, but there's a terrible scene where they engage in a home invasion, which is very Manson-esque, and are involved in what amounts to, you know, a mass murder because of it. Martha is so traumatized by this that she becomes hugely paranoid. She's scared that the cult are coming for her. The sight of a man in the distance with a white t-shirt sitting on a rock while she's bathing in the lake fills her with a kind of existential terror, because she thinks that Patrick may have come for her. And the hold that he has is once again not universal. The fact that she can escape is one thing, but you never really escape these things. You never really get past terrible things that are done to you. Just as Patricia Krenwinkel, Susan Atkins, and Leslie Van Houten, in their long prison journeys, as described by Carleen Faith, spend years and never really get over what has been done to them and what they were made part of. A slightly lighter take on the Charles Manson mythology is the 2015 film Manson Family Vacation. In this movie, you've got a guy called Conrad who's come to visit his brother. He's the black sheep of the family. We discover that actually was adopted. And he's obsessed with Charles Manson. He's a Manson fanboy, and these people exist. The opening scenes show him hitchhiking along the road, and he can't get a lift because he's wearing a t-shirt with Charlie Manson's face on it. And he goes to visit his brother, and his brother, who really kind of keeps him at arm's length, and they never really saw eye to eye, but his brother is convinced by his own wife that he needs to reconnect. So what Conrad does is that he convinces his brother that they should go on a tour of the homes in which the Manson killings happened, and the sites around Hollywood where the Manson stuff was a thing. And they get into all sorts of weird kind of and embarrassing situations. They bullshit their way into one of the murder houses, and the woman who runs it essentially winds up bursting into tears because she correctly identifies this as ghoulish. She correctly points out that it's actually pretty sick. But at the same time, Conrad needs this. He feels lonely. He feels disconnected from his family. He feels the need to have a family. There's a scene where he is sort of reading a book about Manson to his little nephew, and his little nephew's looking at the pictures of the awesome dead bodies. which is kind of problem. And he's sort of saying, well, they were a family and they were the coolest sort of family because they got to choose who they were with, which isn't strictly how it was. But then there's the attraction of it as well. And this is the most important part of this, right? The idea that actually there's a reason why people might have been wanted to be a member of Charles Manson's family. There's a reason why people might have stuck around. And you can't forget that people join cults for a reason. They don't join cults because they're necessarily bonkers. They join cults because cults can give them things that they cannot find elsewhere. As stunted and as dangerous and abusive as those things might be. Carleen Faith, in a book about Leslie Van Houten, wrote, "The warnings to young people to avoid following gurus and to avoid indiscriminate drug use and sex were the most obvious moral lessons to be drawn from the stories of Leslie's association with a dramatic crime, a crime that has no redeeming value. But consider that the Manson murders were emblematic of the ending of the late 60s idealism, the closing of a historical era. In the end, Leslie's story, a 1960s search for enlightenment gone bad, resonates because on some level, like other crimes, it could have happened to anyone in her situation in those times. This is one of the reasons that we're so scared of cults. We're so scared of being brainwashed or talked into things because we know on a level that it might have happened to us if we were in that situation. None of us are immune. Let's talk about Jim Jones. Jim Jones was the founder of a group called the People's Temple. He was a big social justice preacher. He was, very progressive, very liberal. He got a congregation that pulled together people of all ethnic groups and classes and got them working together, and it got them doing charity stuff. And as he got more charismatic and more popular, and as his congregation grew, something happened. And it's difficult to tell what happened for obvious reasons, but he kind of got drunk on the power. He kind of started to exploit the people who were quite willing to follow him to hell and back. Eventually, he set up he set up a commune in Guyana. He moved wholesale. He brought his entire church to Guyana. They all cut off their families and they moved away. And a congregation which was largely made of young families, old people, members of minorities. And he took them to Guyana. He set up an agricultural project. He called it a farming place. His idea would be that it was a multi-class, multicultural utopia. And something terrible happened. And that most people know about this story is that essentially 900 people committed mass suicide on November the 18th, 1978, including Jones himself. Largely, so the story goes, by drinking poisoned Kool-Aid. And people still talk about drinking the Kool-Aid as sort of like taking in a toxic set of beliefs. That's not really how it went. Okay, so this needs to be unpacked a bit. So let's talk about Jackie Speier. Now, Jackie Speier is a congresswoman. in the USA. She's a Democrat congresswoman for California. She is a long-standing American politician. She's one of the grand dames of American politics. She's served California as a Democratic congresswoman faithfully for many years. In 1978, she was the assistant of the Congressman Leo Ryan. And here she is in 1978, shortly before they went to Guyana. Ryan had been contacted by the families of some of the people who were at the People's Temple Agricultural Project, or Jonestown, and concerns were raised. He decided that he was going to fly to Guyana with a group of people on a fact-finding mission to find out exactly what was going down there. He did so. And he turned up. He gets shown around. He turns up unannounced, more or less. He gives Jim Jones maybe a day's notice. Jones had been, although he didn't know this, getting increasingly paranoid. He'd actually done suicide drills beforehand where he'd forced people to drink Kool-Aid and told them it was poisoned, and it wasn't. And Jones sets this up. He goes to Ryan goes to Jonestown. Jones shows him and his people round, and it all looks fantastic, and they spend a whole day there and everything looks amazing. It's kind of weird that only the people that Jones sort of ushers to talk to them, but you know, it looks kind of good. And then someone passes him a note saying, "I need to get out of here, please help me." And then someone else comes to Ryan, and once he says he's going to take one person home, a whole bunch of people, loads of people come and go, "Take us home." And he's like, "Oh, right, okay, well, okay, let's go to the airstrip." So they go to the airstrip and they're trying to arrange a way to bus like dozens and dozens and dozens of people, families, older people, loads of people who are desperate to leave Jonestown. They want to get out of here and they've seen a way of getting home. And Ryan goes back to the airstrip. He tries to get some trucks and things to get people. Jones says, we'll send a bus full of people. And then a truck drives up to the airstrip and it's got guys with machine guns and guns down everybody in Ryan's party. The survivor is Jackie Spire, who survives near fatal injuries, 5 bullet wounds at point blank range. Somehow manages to survive miraculously, fights her way back to health, learns how to walk again from scratch, all those things. Amazing woman. But back at Jonestown, Jones then forces everyone to drink the poison drinks, which aren't just Kool-Aid. Some of it was apparently Gatorade as well, at gunpoint. And those who refuse are either shot or forcibly injected. Something like, I think, 1/6 of the people who are forcibly injected with the Kool-Aid, with the poison, are children who obviously don't have the consent or understanding for that to be suicide. And in the end, over 900 people die. Now, and you know, I showed a picture of the Kool-Aid. The other picture I could have shown is one of the aerial pictures of Jonestown, which literally shows like a vast area of ground just covered in dead bodies. And I found that picture, and I'm like, I'm not putting that in the presentation. This has obviously come up in cinema. So in 2013, Ty West, who's the horror movie director who made House of the Devil, he's working in conjunction with Eli Roth, the Hostel guy. Ty West makes a film called The Sacrament, and The Sacrament is about a bunch of guys working for Vice Media, and they get to use like the real world trademarks of Vice Media, and it's a found footage film. So these guys, one of them has a sister. She is in an agricultural project in Africa, in an unnamed sub-Saharan African country. They go there and it's their footage, and they go there and they interview the people, and they interview the leader, who they call Father, just as he was called Father at Jonestown. And Father seems very charming and shows them, you know, and they're only allowed to talk to the people who they're allowed to talk to, and they're shown around by the guy's sister, who's played by Amy Seimetz, who, you know, actually, to be fair, can do no wrong, but, you know, so, you know, I forgive her for being in this film. And then a mother and daughter come to them and say, can you get us out of here? And then more people come to them, and that plot goes on, and it doesn't work out, and Father forces everybody to commit suicide and guns down all but one of the reporters, and the woman who wanted them to rescue her daughter gorily cuts her daughter's throat on screen, and then her own. And Amy Seimetz's character sets fire to herself, and it's just this cavalcade of nasty things happening. But it doesn't work. I'm going to be honest, The Sacrament is a movie that made me angry. And it made me angry because it takes the superficial events from Jonestown and divorces them from context. So Jim Jones started out as a social justice preacher. He got a group of people to make this project together, to work together. He had hugely devoted followers, and once again, the thing that you need to remember about Jim Jones is the thing that you remember about a lot of people, a lot of these cult leaders, just as it was in Manson, that people are prepared to follow you to the end of the earth until they're not. People will follow you blindly except when they don't. And the bit where people follow you blindly except when they don't is important, because while in The Sacrament you have the people who are, you know, want to leave, in the end, you know, everybody committed suicide, even the people who wanted to leave. And it essentially takes the Jonestown mythology and makes it even, basically underlines the sort of like shallow view of the Jonestown story. It underlines the shallow view of the Jonestown story rather than show it in all its complexity and difficulty and truth. And it just gives you a cavalcade of nasty things happening. It's essentially just an excuse for a succession of horrible stuff. I mean, all right, it's a horror movie, and horror movies are supposed to have horrible stuff in, and it's a horror movie, and they make a point that it's not Jonestown, it's set in the present day, but that's even worse. It's even worse because there's no story. It's just pulled out and made into a nothing. Jim Jones decided to commit suicide because he'd been doing suicide drills for ages, and he'd be getting increasingly and insanely paranoid. And a man from the American government rocks up, and the moment you kill a representative of the American government on foreign soil, the Americans declare fucking war, right? He knew that. A bunch of guys from an online media service in 2013 is just not the same thing. It makes the whole thing nonsensical. Jackie Spire tells the story like pretty well in her autobiography Undaunted. It's basically the first 3 chapters of the book, but she makes this point. The news at the time and the history lessons to follow usually failed to mention that a number of the People's Temple members were shot, several in the field between the pavilion and the jungle, clearly trying to escape. Others, who presumably refused to drink the Kool-Aid, a misguided phrase I very much wish could be scrubbed from our conversations and lexicon, were injected with cyanide and other poisons. There were piles of used syringes left at the scene, and in the image I showed you earlier, there were used syringes there. An eyewitness who managed to escape the massacre described how people who did not cooperate were injected with poison where they sat, or were held down and injected with poison. The precise numbers and causes of death could never be confirmed. But this was not a mass suicide. It was a mass murder. The suicide narrative, of course, has basically become an impossible thing to scrub from our culture. And sometimes that's used in useful ways. So in the 2014 film, The Invitation, which I have spoken about in a previous seminar, you have a cult, and again, this is like Mandy in the sense that it extrapolates the idea of Jonestown as if Jonestown hadn't happened and the sort of suicide thing had sort of continued and changed. And you have, again, the cult metastasizing back into Beverly Hills, into Hollywood, and you have these people convincing other people to, well, drink the Kool-Aid, as it were, or drink poisoned wine in this case. And it has a sense of exploring why someone might wind up doing this sort of thing. It's not 100% satisfying, but it does get across how someone might be lured into it. Okay, so the next cult atrocity we're going to look at, right, is David Koresh. David Koresh was a Seventh-day Adventist, and specifically, he was the leader. David Koresh isn't actually his name; it's his cult leader name. I can't remember what his real name is, but he was the leader of a sect of Seventh-day Adventists who were called the Branch Davidians, and he was a leader of a breakaway sect of Branch Davidians. So he's basically the leader of a sect of a sect of a sect, if you can imagine that. He eventually set up his followers, of which there were, over 200 in a compound in a place called Mount Carmel near Waco, Texas. He was not a good man. Let us be frank about this. Okay, David Koresh was stockpiling guns. He hung out with white supremacists. He was clearly not one of the good guys, but the American government, specifically the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms, backed up by the FBI, decided that he was worrying enough for them to need to raid the place. A siege happened. It took about 6-7 weeks. Eventually they got in, the agents got in, they accidentally set fire to the place, and 76 of David Koresh's followers died, including, I think, about 20 children. This became a bit of a hot potato, particularly among the political far right, among the people who were scared of the American government. And as a result, one of the things that the siege at Waco inspired was the Oklahoma bombing, which was perpetrated by Timothy McVeigh. He, if you remember, bombed the government building in Oklahoma. It's the worst piece of domestic terrorism America ever had, and it's up to that point. And obviously McVeigh was executed for his part in this. But yeah, essentially, the Waco siege is interesting because it's a cult atrocity that was not perpetrated by the cult. I mean, they were belligerent. They stockpiled guns. They hung out with white supremacists. They're fairly hateful. I mean, there is no question of that. But they didn't do anything. They just looked like they might. And they paid for it. In the 1995 movie, The Passion of Darlene, not 2005, like the PowerPoint says. Brendan Fraser plays a young man who escapes from a cult compound that was burnt down by government agents, and whose inhabitants were gunned down. He's the only survivor. He finds himself in the middle of a cabin in the woods that's inhabited by Viggo Mortensen and Ashley Judd, who play a pair of free spirits. They take him in, they try to give him a home, but he can't get past who he was and who he is. He can't get past the fact that he lived in a state of grace and now does not live in a state of grace. This is all mixed up with his burgeoning feelings for Ashley Judd's character Callie. The film has a kind of magic realist poetic vibe that's kind of fatally hamstrung by the fact that Philip Ridley, the screenwriter, clearly, who's an English playwright, clearly doesn't like people much, and especially doesn't like women. And he's got some things to say, but essentially it uses the Waco siege as a way of having a belligerent fundamentalist in a place where there aren't any other belligerent fundamentalists, and not knowing how to deal with people who aren't belligerent fundamentalists. There's a scene where he gets haunted by the ghosts of his mother and father, who are riddled with bullet holes, and they sort of say there's no faith without blood, and they inspire him towards acts of violence. But essentially, the film takes the narrative of Waco and takes it uncritically as an excuse to make points about religion that are very much straw man points about religion. Surprisingly more successful is Kevin Smith's crowdfunded 2011 film Red State. Now, Red State is about a bunch of boys who find a naughty woman on the internet who says that she'll show them a good time, only it turns out that she's actually a member of a cult and that they're actually going to be murdered because God hates fornicators. And you've got this leader of the cult. He is, what's interesting is that although the cult itself isn't Branch Davidian, it's not really based on David Koresh. It's actually based more on Fred Phelps. Fred Phelps, who died about 6 years ago, was the leader of Westboro Baptist Church, who are best known for picketing people's funerals with slogans like "Soldiers die for fag marriage," "Death penalty for fags," "God hates fags," that sort of thing. And essentially, they're a hate group, and they're kind of. I love the fact that there's like a smiling woman in an anorak holding up a sign with rainbow letters that says, "Our love is stronger than your hate." That's kind of, you know, God is with that woman in the blue anorak on the right. Yeah, and you have our man in Red State, this guy. He is essentially Fred Phelps. He's essentially doing this. He essentially repeats Westboro Baptist talking points, the sort of hateful, far-right, bigoted, anti-gay, anti-trans, anti-fornicating, anti-fun kind of thing. There's a little compound. He's in a compound. Stuff happens. There's a succession of things that happen over the course of the movie, and the FBI wind up besieging the place. The boys have a prang in their car on the way to the compound. It's the sheriff's car. The sheriff is, although married to a woman, is giving a young man a blowjob in the car. So now he has to explain why his car's been pranged, and he goes and sends a deputy to the compound. The deputy finds the car from the missing 3 boys. He smells of rats. The cultists panic and shoot the deputy. The sheriff calls in the FBI. The FBI come in. There's a siege, and the siege goes Waco. It's on a much smaller scale. I mean, this is interesting, actually. The fictionalized versions of these cult atrocities aren't actually as horrible as necessarily as the real ones. So in The Sacrament that I mentioned earlier on, it says at the end that something like 160 people die. And of course, in Jonestown, it's over 900 people died. In Red State, there's only about 24 people tops, maybe even a dozen people in the Baptist church in the compound. But so as opposed to the 76 who died at Waco. So it's much smaller. And what happens is that the film actually explores, you have a bunch of these terrible people. I mean, basically Kevin Smith's elevator pitch is, what if Waco only with Westboro Baptist? And they're terrible people, and they're murderers. They murder a gay man in the sort of the film, which of course David Korush's people were never proven to do. But at the same time, the FBI are incompetent, and they're trigger happy, and they're self-serving, and John Goodman's character is decent, fundamentally decent, but tired and a bit cynical, and he can't stop the terrible things happening because no one else is letting him stop them happening. And it escalates to the point where it all is, in this version, the hate preacher gets out alive, and it actually ends on a moment of ridiculous farce. There's a literal deus ex machina as a group of students in the field next door, well, a group of people running a weed farm in the field next door, essentially decide that this is the moment they're going to troll the Baptist church by using a loudspeaker to make the sound of trumpets, so that the fundamentalists think it's the rapture. And so he's like, come out or shoot me because I'm going to fly to heaven. And of course it doesn't happen, and they all get arrested. But it's a brutally cynical film. It's it's blackly funny, but mainly it just has this view of human nature as a deadly miserable thing. And is that really the legend, the lesson we can get from Waco? I don't know what the lesson we get from the Waco siege is, to be honest. It's a difficult one to imagine. Obviously, it's being dramatized various ways recently with the TV series of Michael Shannon, Taylor Kitsch. But what have we gained from this story? Okay, I want to talk about one more cult story, and this is the story of Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, who went by the names Doe and T. I don't know where Rami, Solar, and the other Doe were, but Doe and T were the leaders of a group called Heaven's Gate, and T, Bonnie Nettles, died in 1985, but her teachings are basically central to it, and she gives Marshall Applewhite the idea that something is going to happen. The Hale-Bopp comet was coming to Earth in 1997, and Marshall Applewhite was convinced that that was the time where the planet Earth was going to be destroyed, and that the members of his group needed to ascend. They needed to go to the next level. He got them uniform shirts and matching Nike trainers. The uniform shirts had patches on them that said Heaven's Gate Away Team. And he and 38 of his followers, well, first, he and 38 of his followers had themselves castrated. They're mostly, all the ones who were men had themselves castrated, and then they committed suicide. And, you know, obviously this was a big deal, and 2 of his followers were left behind, who are still around. They're still around, and they're still running the online presence of Heaven's Gate, even today. Yeah, people look at the Heaven's Gate story and they just think it's pointless, but Marshall Applewhite clearly had some charisma. But and again, another interesting, when Applewhite and Nettles were working together in the 1980s, they had several hundred followers. The number that agreed to castrate themselves and then ascend to the next level in the Heaven's Gate Away Team with Doe were 38. And again, this kind of draws us back to the point that you only blindly follow a cult leader until you don't. That a cult leader's charisma is not foolproof. It doesn't work on everyone. Now, a lot of people find the whole castrating yourself thing really strange, but, you know, Applewhite was actually fairly well versed in history. And I mean, you know, going back in the 1st century AD and BC, you have the cult of Cybele Attis, and they customarily used these nutcrackers, as it were, literal nutcrackers, to castrate the priests. I kind of find it sort of, these are in the British Museum, they're made of bronze. I find it actually personally hilarious that that modern day scholars look at these and can't understand why anyone might want to do that. I think, you know, there's an entire part of historical discourse in gender studies about why people might do that has been largely untouched. And so you just have straight scholars going, what do you want to do that for? Anyway, so 20th of March 1997, they're all found lying down in their Nike trainers under purple blankets. With their bags packed. ready to fly away. An interview earlier this year with the 2 remaining Heaven's Gate members who are still utterly on thing included this statement: "There was no suicide. Those 39 individuals transferred from their human bodies to new space-capable next-level bodies. Only humans see them as dying. Only those 39 individuals were allowed to perform this transfer under the supervision of the next level. No human can do this, and that is why we are against suicide. All humans do is trigger a premature reincarnation on this planet to repeat the lesson steps again when they commit suicide. Don't worry, we are taken care of." And I think the point is that they're convinced to have done this because they were convinced that they were not killing themselves. And you might think that's bonkers, but then there's at least one major world religion that believes that after you die, you transfer to a body in a new heaven and a new earth. You know, you have a heavenly body after you die. So, and you know, Matt Applewhite himself used a lot of Christian language. So, yeah, it's bonkers, but how much more bonkers is it than any other religion that we adhere to? In the 2017 film The Endless, we are introduced to Camp Arcadia, which is a camp out in the wilderness where a whole bunch of people live in a commune and they don't leave. And there is a videotape is sent to a couple of people who were in the cults and left that suggested that these people are going to ascend. And there is some concern that the people in Camp Arcadia are going to commit a sort of mass suicide. Now, it's a bit more complex than that. Once again, the impetus for them doing whatever it is they're planning on doing is because of unusual atmospheric and heavenly bodies. In this case, above Camp Arcadia, you can see 3 moons. Justin and Aaron, who are brothers, they abandoned the cult some time ago. They're drawn back in to visit the place. They're played by Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead, the actual directors and writers of the film. And Aaron was very young when his older brother took him out. His brother told him that they were a suicide cult, they're obsessed with UFOs, and also interestingly that they all castrated themselves. So immediately the parallel is drawn to Heaven's Gate. In fact, actually, it's drawn to Heaven's Gate in dialogue in the course of the movie. So there is that. In the movie, there is actually something happening. There is actually an inexplicable supernatural agency that the cultists are in contact with, although what they are doing at Camp Arcadia might not actually have anything to do with what the thing, the sort of Lovecraftian entity that has power over the area and over time itself might want. But it is interesting that so much of the communication from Camp Arcadia is again done in video. Marshall Applewhite basically sent all his communiques out in videotapes on VHS cassettes, and the Heaven's Gate website has which still exists, and it looks exactly as it did in 1997, has transcripts of his videos, transcripts of 2 recent videos. It says at the bottom of the screen, you can sort of see that there. In fact, actually, recent means 1997, just before Marshall Applewhite led people to pass to the next level. Look at this. This is a tragic and creepy time capsule to another world. Anyway, on the site. Oh, no. Okay, so on the site, he talks about all sorts of things that, you know, they say, we are happily prepared to leave this world and go with T's crew, T having gone on ahead. If you study the material on this website, you'll hopefully understand our joy and what our purpose here on Earth has been. You may even find your boarding pass to leave with us. So, there is a sense that they're kind of, they speak in the terms of benevolence, the Heaven's Gate people, and likewise the Camp Arcadia people. Even when we find out what's doing, and is there a mass suicide? Is what they do a mass suicide? Why do they do it? All of that draws back to Heaven's Gate, and it sort of expresses it. And this is used as a framework for a story about how you leave these things, but you never really leave, and about how you regret the good things in abusive situations when things get bad, and also about where you find family and community. So the film The Endless is actually uses the Heaven's Gate thing as a jumping off point, and it uses that Heaven's Gate thing as a fairly respectful jumping off point as well. All of the cult atrocities are approached in the 7th season of American Horror Story. Now, one of the great things about American Horror Story, at least one of the most fun things, is the way in which any given season of American Horror Story goes completely off the rails at some point, and the joy in it is actually figuring out whether this is going to be the episode where it goes completely off the rails. You know, how long can they sustain this? Oh, there it goes. It's jumped the shark every time. American Horror Story cult is not really any exception from this. What's interesting is it's largely regarded as the worst season of American Horror Story. I think it's actually one of the most interesting seasons. Is the one that has no supernatural stuff. You have Kai Anderson, who's played by Evan Peters, because of course he's played by Evan Peters, because everybody in American Horror Story is either played by Evan Peters or Sarah Paulson. And Kai Anderson is a young man, and he's a kind of like outright internet shit poster who starts a cult, and he starts a sort of conspiracy cults that's aiming on taking over America, along with his sister Winter, who's played by Billie Lourd, who's there on the right. And over the course of the show, what it does is that he explores the techniques of all of the great cult atrocities. He goes through them all, and you have these wonderful scenes where, yeah, and you know, he goes to the media, he does a lot of outright kind of like stuff, he gets into politics, he presents himself as a good young man in politics and all that sort of thing, and at the same time sort of cycles through all the different sort of things, and uses his main victim, a woman called Ali, who's played by Sarah Paulson, who's married to somebody played by Alison Pill, and Ali has Ali voted for Jill Stein in the 2016 election and is now being blamed for Donald Trump being president of the USA. And this has caused fault lines in her marriage, even though actually Jill Stein, even if everyone had voted for Jill Stein had voted for Hillary Clinton, it wouldn't have made a difference because the Electoral College fell that way. But the point being that essentially they're using the cult thing as a way of exploring the Trump cult and about America and about the alt-right and all those other sorts of things. And the biggest problem with it is that Ryan Murphy decides over the course of this to pit the alt-right in a kind of both sides kind of way against sort of internet liberalism, as if that's the same thing. And don't get me wrong, a lot of internet liberals are utterly insufferable, but that's not how it works. Anyway, at the start, you know, there's sort of like have these people in creepy, spooky, ooky clown masks and things. You have evil clowns stabbing people up and fomenting fear. Gradually that gets discarded, and eventually Kai Anderson leads a group of sort of outright 4chan style Fight Club inspired like brutes. And what's interesting is that he then has these weird flashbacks. So there's a flashback where where Evan Peters plays Jim Jones, or rather Evan Peters plays Kai Anderson playing Jim Jones, who dies and who is then confronted by Evan Peters playing Kai Anderson playing Jesus, who comes down from heaven on strings to lift him up to heaven. You have Evan Peters playing Kai Anderson playing Charles Manson. You have Evan Peters playing Kai Anderson playing Marshall Applewhite. And you have Evan Peters playing Kai Anderson playing David Koresh as well. He's in it too. And Evan Peters also plays Andy Warhol as well. And Andy Warhol, who gets shot by Valerie Solanas. And what American Horror Story Cult does is that it pits against Kai Anderson's alt-right cult a radical feminist cult. It suggests that Valerie Solanas is now best known as the woman who shot Andy Warhol, right? But she was in fact a radical feminist thinker. She led a group which was called Scum, the Society for Cutting Up Men, and with the Scum Manifesto, which is a hardline lesbian revolutionary manifesto. You know, straight men, gay men, and people born with penises do not have a place in the world that she puts forward. It's also kind of funny, which is kind of weird. But anyway, what American Horror Story does is suggest that Scum was in fact a cult led by Valerie Solanas, and that it survived after Valerie Solanas's death, and that it was also trying to foment fear and war in America, and that Scum was in fact behind the Zodiac Killer. Which, well, it doesn't make sense, because essentially in order to find a left-wing cult that is of a comparable sort of horror with all the right-wing cults, Manson and Koresh and that, they have to make one up. They have to take a fictional character, take a real-world character and turn it into fiction. Now, this is when I talk about the other cult leaders in American Horror Story Cult, I talk about Evan Peters playing Kai Anderson, playing Jim Jones, playing Charles Manson, because he tells these stories. These stories are told by Kai Anderson to his followers in flashback, and he uncritically repeats the mythology of these stories in such a way as a child can see through them. And in fact, actually, there is a scene where a child literally sees through them. But it's still not quite explicit enough. And you've still got him being wrong about these cults, but in the objective worlds of the show, Valerie Solanas' cult being real. So it's kind of problematic. I mean, it's an American horror story. It's the entire point. They just want to make a horror story that's American, and they want to do the cult horror stories and do the mythology of them. And I think it serves the program for it to be uncritical, but real people died. There were real tragedies in these stories. And that's kind of troubling. I don't know if it's the worst season of American Horror, so I still think it's better than the first season, but it's definitely the one that's most messed up. I don't know where this brings us. I mean, that's basically been a whistle-stop tour of the cult atrocities and how they've been presented in fictions, and how they've inspired fictions more correctly. The feminist cult wins. You have basically bad hombres versus nasty women, and the nasty women win. Ali, Sarah Paulson's character in season 7, becomes the main leader of a third generation of scum. It doesn't work. And I wonder if that's where we're coming to an end, that with these fictions, they draw us to a place where the mythology overtakes the real world. The fictions that have been most successful, you think of The Endless, The Invitation, these tends to be the ones, or Martha, Marcy, May, Marlene, these tend to be the ones that essentially take a version of the mythology and use it as a springboard to tell other stories. The ones that try to retell the story or try to explore these stories directly somehow never seem to work. I wonder why that is. I wonder what it is that makes these things so slippery, so difficult to have a hold on. In one of Marshall Applewhite's last videos, he talks about hearts being broken. I don't mean to make light of that hearts will be broken. I know that hearts are broken. I also know that anyone who leaves to go to my Father's kingdom, that any heart that is broken in the process of that transition can easily be more than healed. If that heart looks to my Father for healing and looks to my Father for understanding, that soul does not need to see this as a terrible experience. Many times the worst things in the human kingdom that can happen to us end up being the best things that can happen to us. I don't know why I picked that quote in retrospect. I find it quite disturbing. I think there's a sense that these stories are slippery because the narratives of the people who perpetrated these atrocities, or at the center of them anyway, are also slippery. If you have an entire tradition of people lying to themselves, it can be really difficult to find truths in that. And when you look at a statement that's as slippery and as messed up as this, and as manipulative as this, let's make no mistake, then somehow perhaps it brings some sort of clarity, some sort of weird kind of like paradoxical clarity to the idea that these stories are so difficult for our culture to approach.